August 25, 1944. Cherbourg Harbor, Normandy, France. The wrench slipped from Sergeant William Henderson's grease-stained hands as he stared at the endless convoy forming before him. The British said these trucks would fail. They said the design was flawed, underpowered, and worthless for modern warfare. Now Henderson watched as 6,000 of them prepared to attempt the impossible to supply General Patton's racing Third Army across 400 m of devastated French countryside. The letters GMC stamped on the hood stood for General Motors Corporation. But to the 75% African-American drivers climbing into those cabs exhausted before their journey even began, those letters meant something else entirely. They meant survival. They meant the difference between victory and defeat. They meant the lifeline that would keep Allied armies pushing toward Germany. What none of them knew that August morning was that this truck, deemed inadequate by British military experts just 4 years earlier, would prove more valuable than tanks, more crucial than fighters, more essential than any weapon system in the European theater. The humble 2-in-1 or 2-ton GMC CCKW, the Jimmy, the Deuce, and a half was about to write itself into history as the backbone of the most desperate supply operation the world had ever seen. The story begins not in the chaos of war, but in the quiet design rooms of General Motors in 1939. The United States Army Ordnance Corps had issued specifications for a new medium tactical truck. They needed a 2-in-10R 2-ton load-rated vehicle with 6-wheel drive capability able to operate off-road in any weather condition. The requirement seemed straightforward. The solution would prove anything but. General Motors Truck and Coach Division, operating from their Pontiac, Michigan facility, approached the problem with modified commercial truck components. They took their existing AX series truck design and made critical modifications. A second rear axle for improved traction and load distribution. All-wheel drive for off-road capability. Strengthened frame rails to handle military loads. The result was designated ACKWX 353, the predecessor to what would become the CCKW. The initial design utilized a GMC 248 cubic inline 6-cylinder engine producing just 77 horsepower. The trucks weighed 9,856 pounds empty, and measured 264 in long, 94.5 in wide, and 118 in tall. By commercial standards, they were adequate. By military standards, they were questionable. France placed an order for 1,000 of these experimental 6x6 trucks in late 1939. Production began at Yellow Truck and Coach Manufacturing Company's facilities. The trucks featured closed steel cabs, fixed bedsides, troop seats, and conventional styling that would not have looked out of place on civilian construction sites. They were in essence commercial trucks in military clothing. Then came the catastrophe that changed everything. German Panzer Division smashed through the Ardennes Forest in May 1940, bypassing the Maginot Line and driving deep into France. The French army, despite having some of the most advanced tanks and fortifications in Europe, collapsed under the speed and coordination of German combined arms warfare. The British Expeditionary Force retreated to Dunkirk. France fell in 6 weeks. 2,000 of the ACKWX trucks had already been delivered to France. They were captured by German forces and would ironically serve the V-Termite on the Eastern Front, where German soldiers grudgingly admitted their reliability. The remaining order, along with additional units still being built, was diverted to Great Britain under emergency wartime contracts. The British Army took delivery of the ACKWX trucks in summer 1940 and immediately subjected them to rigorous testing. British military evaluators were not impressed. Their reports preserved in military archives were damning. The wheelbase was too long for European roads and trails. The trucks were difficult to maneuver in tight spaces. The 77-horsepower engine was underpowered for the vehicle's weight, especially when fully loaded. Acceleration was poor. Hill climbing ability was marginal. The trucks struggled in mud and soft terrain despite their 6-wheel drive. British Army officials concluded the ACKWX was unsuitable for modern mechanized warfare. They deemed the design fundamentally flawed. Rather than commit these trucks to combat use where British lives might depend on them, the War Office made a decision. They diverted approximately 1,000 units to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease agreements in 1941. A total of 2,466 ACKWX trucks were built across all recipients. The British rejection appeared to validate concerns that American truck manufacturers accustomed to wide highways and gentle terrain could not produce vehicles suitable for European warfare. General Motors engineers, stung by this assessment, went back to their drawing boards. The lessons from the ACKWX experience were clear. More power was needed. The chassis required refinement. The wheelbase needed options for different missions. But the fundamental concept, a 6x6 medium tactical truck built from commercial components for rapid mass production, remained sound. American engineers understood something their British colleagues had overlooked. This was not about building the perfect truck. This was about building adequate trucks in numbers that would overwhelm any enemy through sheer industrial capacity. In 1941, General Motors introduced the redesigned version designated CCKW. The nomenclature came from GMC's internal coding system. C was designed in 1941, second C for conventional cab design, K for all-wheel drive, W for dual tandem rear axles. The improvements over the ACKWX were substantial, but not revolutionary. The new GMC 270 cubic inline six-cylinder engine replaced the 248, producing 104 horsepower at 2,750 revolutions per minute. A 27 horsepower increase might not sound dramatic, but it transformed the truck's performance. The engine delivered 216 ftbs of torque at 1,400 revolutions per minute, providing the low-end power needed for heavy loads and steep grades. Engineers designed two wheelbase options. The CCKW 352 with 145 in wheelbase served as a short wheelbase variant for artillery prime mover duties. The CCKW 353 with 164 in wheelbase became the standard cargo configuration. This flexibility allowed the same basic truck to fill multiple roles across different combat units. The frame was a conventional ladder design with riveted crossmembers simple to manufacture and repair. 3 beam axles, all driven, provided the 6x6 capability. The front axle is mounted on leaf springs. The rear tandem used leaf springs with locating arms to control axle movement. Brakes were hydraulic with vacuum assist, a significant improvement over older mechanical systems. Tires were 750/20, providing reasonable ground clearance and load capacity. Initial production models retained the closed metal cab from the ACKWX design. But as war production accelerated and steel became a ration strategic material, GMC engineers made a critical decision. Beginning in July 1943, new CCKW trucks received open cabs with canvas tops and removable doors. This change saved approximately 150 pounds of steel per vehicle. Multiply that by hundreds of thousands of trucks and the steel savings became enough to build dozens of destroyers or hundreds of tanks. The cargo bed went through evolution driven by material constraints. Early trucks had all-steel beds which proved heavy. Wooden beds replaced them but warped and cracked under military loads. A composite design with steel framing and wooden floor slats still proved inadequate. The final design returned to simplified all-steel construction that reduced material waste while maintaining durability. What emerged was a truck that prioritized simplicity, reliability, and ease of mass production over performance. The CCKW would never win races. It would never impress engineers with sophisticated technology, but it could be built in enormous numbers by semi-skilled workers using available materials, and it could be repaired in field conditions by mechanics with basic tools and limited training. General Motors placed the primary production contract with their yellow truck and coach facility in Pontiac, Michigan. As orders multiplied, Chevrolet's St. Louis, Missouri plant joined production. At peak output, these two facilities were completing one CCKW truck every 7 minutes, 24 hours per day, 7 days per week. The assembly lines never stopped. The manufacturing process itself represented American industrial might. Raw materials entered one end of the Pontiac plant and finished trucks rolled out the other. Sheet metal was stamped into body panels. Frames were welded and riveted. Engines were assembled from hundreds of precision components. Transmissions, axles, and suspension systems were built in separate facilities and shipped to final assembly. The entire operation employed tens of thousands of workers, many of them women, who had entered the workforce to replace men serving in combat. Production numbers tell the story of American industrial mobilization. From 1941 through 1945, General Motors manufactured approximately 562,750 cubic centimeters trucks across all variants. This figure includes specialized versions, but represents standard production models, excluding cab-over engine variants and non-all-wheel drive models. Standard CCKW production totaled approximately 518,000 to 519,000 units. To put this in perspective, Germany produced approximately 100,000 total trucks of all types during the same period. The Soviet Union, despite massive American Lend-Lease aid, manufactured fewer than 200,000 trucks. Great Britain's entire wartime truck production was dwarfed by this single American model. The CCKW alone nearly equaled the combined truck production of all Axis powers. The CCKW spawned dozens of specialized variants. Dump trucks for engineer units, tankers for fuel and water transport, mobile workshops equipped with lathes and welding equipment, communications vans, housing, radio equipment, ambulances with medical supplies and stretcher racks, wrecker trucks with cranes for recovering disabled vehicles, anti-aircraft platforms mounting quadruple 50 caliber machine guns. Each variant used the same basic chassis, engine and drivetrain, simplifying maintenance and spare parts logistics. But numbers mean nothing without application. And in June 1944, the CCKW faced its greatest test. The test would not come from German anti-tank guns or Luftwaffe bombers. It would come from simple physics, from the tyranny of distance, and the mathematics of supply. June 6, 1944. Over 150,000 Allied soldiers landed on 5 Normandy beaches. The largest amphibious invasion in history achieved tactical surprise and established a lodgment on Hitler's Atlantic Wall. But lodgment is not victory. By mid-July, more than 1 million Allied troops were crammed into a pocket approximately 50 miles wide and 20 m deep. They were going nowhere. The Germans had turned Normandy into a defensive nightmare. Ancient hedge. Thick walls of earth and vegetation dating back centuries divided the landscape into thousands of small fields. Each hedgerow was a ready-made defensive position. Each field became a separate battle. American infantry and armor bled through this brokerage country at horrific cost, gaining yards instead of miles. Then came Operation Cobra. On July 25, 1944, American forces launched a massive breakout attempt supported by saturation bombing. Within days, German defensive lines cracked. American armored divisions poured through the breach. By early August, General George Patton's Third Army was racing across open French countryside, covering 50-60, sometimes 80 m per day. The advance threatened to trap and destroy entire German armies. But Patton's tankers soon faced an enemy more dangerous than any Panzer division. They were running out of fuel. Each Sherman tank consumed approximately 150 gallons of gasoline per 100 m of travel. An armored division with approximately 250 tanks burned through massive quantities during rapid advance. Add trucks, jeeps, and other vehicles, and fuel consumption reached staggering levels. Patton commanded multiple divisions, spread across hundreds of miles of front. His fuel requirements alone exceeded 400,000 gallons daily. The First Army needed similar amounts. British and Canadian forces required their own supply lines. Total Allied fuel consumption in early August 1944 exceeded 3 million gallons per day. The Allies had planned for rapid advance. They had prepared supply depots and established logistics networks, but nobody had anticipated this dramatic breakthrough. Within 2 weeks of the Cobra breakout, American spearheads were 200 m from the Normandy beaches. Within a month, lead elements approached 350 miles from their supply bases. Every gallon of fuel, every shell, every can of rations had to travel that distance over war-damaged roads through a French transportation network that Allied bombing had systematically destroyed in the months before D-Day. The destruction of French railroads had been deliberate to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the invasion beaches. Allied air forces had spent April, May, and June 1944 systematically bombing every railroad yard, bridge, and marshalling center within 200 m of Normandy. The campaign succeeded brilliantly. German panzer divisions took weeks to reach the front instead of days. But those same bombed railroads could not now supply Allied armies racing toward Germany. The Mulberry harbors, those incredible artificial ports towed across the English Channel, had sustained the invasion force through June and July. But a massive storm in mid-June had destroyed the American Mulberry. The British Mulberry at Aramanes remained operational, but could not handle the tonnage requirements of 2 entire army groups. Cherbourg had been captured, but its port facilities were so thoroughly demolished by German engineers that restoration would take months. In late August 1944, American commanders faced catastrophe. Patton's tanks were running dry 300 m from their supply bases. The First Army was rationing ammunition. Combat effectiveness hung by a thread. Without immediate massive resupply, the Allied advance would stall. German forces would gain time to consolidate new defensive lines. The opportunity to end the war in 1944 would be lost. On August 21, 1944, American logistics officers held an emergency planning conference. 36 hours of nonstop meetings produced a solution so desperate, so audacious that it could only have been conceived by Americans raised on transcontinental highways and massive trucking networks. They would create a dedicated express convoy system similar to priority freight trains. Every available truck would be pressed into continuous service. 2 one-way routes would be established from Normandy to forward supply points. All civilian traffic would be banned. Military police would control every intersection to ensure convoys never stopped. The plan required more trucks than any single command possessed. Within hours, logistics officers began stripping trucks from every non-critical unit in the European theater. Artillery battalions gave up their prime movers. Engineer units surrendered construction equipment haulers. Medical companies released ambulances. Infantry divisions lost their organic transportation. Every truck capable of rolling became part of the operation. The primary vehicle was the GMC CCCKW. By August 1944, tens of thousands of these trucks had been shipped to Europe. They sat in motor pools parked at supply depots scattered across the rear areas. Now they were marshaled for the greatest truck convoy in history. 6,000 vehicles were assembled. Later that number would peak at nearly 6,000 trucks actually on the road simultaneously. But trucks need drivers, and here American racism created both crisis and opportunity. The United States Army in 1944 remained strictly segregated. African American soldiers served in separate units under predominantly white officers. Military policy based on racist assumptions held that black soldiers lacked the intelligence and courage for combat roles. Therefore, African means were assigned primarily to service units, quartermaster companies, port battalions, transportation units, truck drivers. In August 1944, the European theater contained approximately 210,000 African American soldiers. Nearly half, about 93,000, served in the Quartermaster Corps. When the call went out for truck drivers, these men answered not because they wanted to drive trucks for 60 hours straight. Not because they enjoyed being segregated and discriminated against while fighting for freedom abroad. They answered because their country needed them. Because combat troops depended on them. Because African American soldiers understood that serving with distinction advanced the cause of civil rights at home. 17,000 African-American soldiers became Red Ball Express drivers. 3,000 additional white soldiers joined them, though in practice the operation remained largely segregated with black and white units running separate convoys. The drivers ranged in age from 18 to 40, though most were under 24. Many had never driven a truck before military service. Some came from urban areas where nobody owned cars. They received hasty training, sometimes just days, before being declared qualified to drive 2-in-1/half-ton military trucks loaded with 5 tons of cargo through combat zones. The African-American soldiers who became Red Ball Express drivers came from every corner of the United States. Farm boys from Mississippi who had driven tractors but never trucks. Factory workers from Detroit who knew assembly lines but not military logistics. College students whose educations were interrupted by the draft. Sharecroppers' sons seeking better opportunities than the Jim Crow South offered. Men who had faced discrimination their entire lives now found themselves entrusted with the most critical supply mission of the war. The Red Bull Express began operation on August 25, 1944. The name came from railroad terminology dating to the late 1800s. Railroad companies marked priority express freight cars with red balls signaling all other traffic to yield right-of-way. Now red balls appeared on signs marking dedicated truck routes across France. Red balls were painted on truck hoods identifying convoy vehicles. Red Ball Express. The system was brilliantly simple. 2 parallel one-way routes connected Normandy ports to forward supply depots. The northern route carried loaded trucks toward the front. The southern route returned empty trucks to Normandy, often carrying German prisoners westward as backhaul cargo. Total route length eventually stretched nearly 400 m as the front moved east. Convoys officially consisted of at least 5 trucks with jeep escorts front and rear. Trucks were ordered to maintain 60-yard intervals and 25 miles per hour maximum speed. In reality, individual trucks often departed as soon as they were loaded without waiting for convoy formation. Speed limits became suggestions rather than rules. Drivers removed or disabled engine governors, pushing the CCKW trucks well past their designed 56 miles per hour maximum. Some veterans reported speeds exceeding 60 miles per hour, a terrifying velocity in a 2-and-1/2-ton truck with 1940 suspension and brakes. The 793rd Military Police Battalion provided route security and traffic control. MPs manned every major intersection, ensuring Red Bull convoys never stopped for cross-traffic. They directed lost drivers, reported accidents, and fought a losing battle against speed limit violations. Some MPs took to riding with convoys when their jeeps proved too slow to keep up with speeding trucks. Each round trip took approximately 54 hours as the front moved farther east. 2-man driver teams shared duties, though in practice both men often stayed awake for entire runs. The trucks carried everything forward. 5-gallon jerry cans of gasoline, ammunition in wooden crates, food rations in cardboard boxes, medical supplies, spare parts, mail from home, and occasionally unofficial cargo, including black market items and personal packages. Loading operations at Cherbourg and other Normandy ports ran 24 hours daily. Steaders, many of them also African American, worked with brutal efficiency. A CCKW could be loaded with 5 tons of cargo in under 10 minutes. Drivers signed for their loads, received route instructions, and rolled toward the front. No rest stops, no delays. Keep them rolling. The journey itself was an ordeal that would break modern safety regulations in 100 ways. Drivers operated in blackout conditions at night using tiny cat-eye blackout lights that provided almost no illumination. They navigated by memory, by following the truck ahead by sheer instinct. Roads were often cratered from bombing or shelling. Bridges were damaged. Detours were unmarked. Getting lost meant burning precious fuel and delaying critical supplies. German air attacks, though increasingly rare, by late summer 1944, remained a threat. The Luftwaffe could still mount occasional raids, and a convoy of trucks made a tempting target. Drivers learned to watch the sky, to listen for the distinctive sound of German engines to scatter off roads when air raid warnings sounded. Some trucks mounted 50-caliber machine guns on ring mounts above the passenger seat. These provided reassurance more than effective defense. Landmines posed a constant danger. German forces planted mines in road shoulders and likely parking areas. Some were sophisticated triggered devices. Others were crude, buried shells or captured munitions wired to detonate under vehicle weight. Red Bull drivers learned to stay on pavement, to park only in cleared areas, to watch for disturbed earth or suspicious objects. Fatigue was the greatest enemy. Men pushed themselves past human limits, sustained by coffee and determination. Some drivers took Benzedrine tablets, amphetamines issued by medical officers to combat exhaustion. Though this practice was officially discouraged, the drugs kept men awake but impaired judgment, leading to accidents. Many drivers relied instead on strong coffee, cigarettes, and sheer willpower to stay alert during marathon runs. Accidents became common. Trucks collided, overturned, or crashed into obstacles. Drivers fell asleep at the wheel despite their best efforts. Vehicles ran off roads in darkness. Some accidents proved fatal. The Army assigned relief drivers to ride in passenger seats, taking over when primary drivers could no longer function safely. Even so, exhaustion took its toll. The trucks themselves suffered terribly. The CCKW was designed for military use, but continuous operation without proper maintenance exceeded any design specification. Engines overheated in summer heat while hauling maximum loads at high speed. Transmissions failed under abuse. Clutches burned out. Brakes wore through pads in days instead of months. Tires subjected to overloading and high speeds on rough roads failed with alarming frequency. Maintenance was performed under impossible conditions. Mechanics worked beside roads and fields under tarps strung between trucks. They had basic tools and whatever spare parts could be spread. Many repairs were field expedient. Good enough to get the truck moving again, not proper rebuilds. Oil changes were skipped. Scheduled maintenance was ignored. Everything was sacrificed to keep trucks rolling. Mechanics became masters of improvisation. They fashioned gaskets from scavenged materials. They bypassed broken components with jewelry-rigged solutions. They cannibalized parts from one truck to repair another. The CCKW's simple design made this possible. A mechanic with basic skills could diagnose problems, identify needed parts, and perform repairs using whatever materials were available. This adaptability, born of desperate necessity, proved one of the truck's greatest strengths. By late August, broken trucks littered the Red Bull routes. Some estimates suggest over 80 vehicles were simply abandoned when they could not be quickly repaired. Drivers took what parts they could carry and hitched rides on passing convoys. Wrecker trucks worked continuously to recover disabled vehicles, but often they too broke down under the strain. At one point, nearly 30% of Red Bull trucks had significant mechanical problems that should have removed them from service, but they kept rolling anyway because the alternative was unthinkable. Yet, the operation succeeded beyond all projections. Within 5 days of starting, the Red Bull Express hit peak capacity. On August 29, 1944, 132 truck companies operating 5,958 vehicles delivered 12,342 tons of supplies to 4 depots. This single-day performance exceeded every pre-war estimate of what was logistically possible. The numbers continued to climb. Daily deliveries averaged between 10,000 and 12,500 tons. 900 trucks were on the road at any given moment. Over 82 days of operation, Red Bull Express drivers hauled 412,193 tons of supplies across France. They drove 121 million ton-miles, a figure representing the tonnage multiplied by distance. They kept multiple army groups supplied during the most rapid advance in military history. Private James Rookard of the 514th Quartermaster Regiment later recalled the experience. We hauled anything General Patton needed. Gasoline, ammunition, food, medical supplies. We took it all the way to the front lines. Back and forth, back and forth. Some drivers ran into ambushes. My company was lucky, but there was shooting all around us. We had to watch for V1 buzz bombs. They would fly over and then drop like regular bombs. My worst memories were seeing trucks get blown up and being afraid I might get killed. But when General Patton said, "Be there," you were there. Even if you had to drive all day and all night, Ruckerd's testimony captured the reality of Red Ball operations. The constant fear, the exhaustion that made every mile feel like 10, the pride in knowing their work mattered, the determination to get through no matter what. His company made the run from Cherbourg to Forward Depot dozens of times during the operation's 82 days. They lost trucks to accidents, mechanical failures, and occasional enemy action, but they never failed to deliver their cargo. Corporal Washington Rector of the 3916 Quartermaster Truck Company described the racial dynamics. "You accepted discrimination. We were warned not to fraternize with whites for fear problems would arise. Some white drivers would try to prevent black drivers from passing their convoys, creating dangerous road conditions. But most white combat troops appreciated us. They knew we were risking our lives to get them what they needed." Rector's account revealed the complex racial tensions that existed within the Red Ball Express itself. Black and white units often operated separately. When they did interact, discrimination sometimes manifested in petty ways. White MPs might stop black drivers more frequently. White mess facilities might serve black drivers last. White drivers might refuse to help black drivers with mechanical problems. Yet on the roads when German shells fell or when a truck broke down, far from help, race often mattered less than survival. Black and white drivers sometimes helped each other despite official segregation policies. The trucks themselves became legendary among drivers. The CCKW could take incredible abuse. You could overload them, overspeed them, skip maintenance, and they kept running. Sure, they broke down a lot. The transmissions were weak. The brakes wore out fast, but you could fix them with basic tools. That's what mattered. A complicated truck that needed a factory to repair would have been useless. Jimmy was simple. Simple meant it worked. Drivers developed deep familiarity with their trucks. They learned the sound of every component, recognizing when something was about to fail. They knew how hard they could push before risking catastrophic breakdown. They understood which problems could be ignored temporarily and which required immediate attention. This intimate knowledge came from spending days and nights behind the wheel, from performing their own repairs, from pushing the vehicles to their absolute limits and beyond. By September 1944, the Red Ball Express was delivering supplies to depot 350 miles from Normandy. The logistics became increasingly complex. Longer distances meant lower daily tonnage per truck. More trucks broke down from extended operation. Driver fatigue became critical. The French railroad system, which Allied engineers worked frantically to repair, remained largely inoperative. New ports, especially Antwerp in Belgium, were still in German hands or too damaged to use. The strain showed in every aspect of the operation. Accident rates climbed. Some convoys were ambushed by bypassed German units still fighting in isolated pockets. Theft became a problem as valuable cargo disappeared from trucks parked at rest stops. Gasoline, cigarettes, and food rations found their way onto black markets in liberated French cities. Some stolen goods appeared on black markets in Paris and other cities. Drivers and cargo handlers faced accusations, often unfounded, contributing to racial tensions. Military police investigated numerous incidents, but rarely recovered stolen materials. Yet, the trucks kept rolling because the alternative was unthinkable. General Patton's Third Army, the spearhead of the Allied advance, consumed supplies faster than any military formation in history. His tankers were engaged in nearly continuous combat, expending ammunition at rates that shocked supply officers. Each tank engagement could burn through a full combat load, requiring immediate resupply. Patton's aggressive tactics generated results, destroyed German divisions, and captured territory, but only because the Red Ball Express kept his forces fueled and armed. Patton himself recognized the operation's importance. Though famous for bold armored tactics, he understood that logistics enabled everything. His tanks were worthless without fuel, his artillery silent without shells, his infantry ineffective without food and ammunition. The Red Ball Express made his rapid advance possible. Without it, Third Army would have ground to a halt within weeks of the breakout, giving German forces time to establish new defensive lines that might have prolonged the war for months or years. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, recognized the operation's importance. In an October message to Red Ball Express personnel, he wrote, "To you drivers and mechanics and your officers who keep the Red Ball vehicles constantly moving, I wish to express my deep appreciation. You're doing an excellent job." Eisenhower understood military logistics better than most commanders. His experience planning Operation Torch in North Africa had taught him that supply determined what operations were possible. No amount of tactical brilliance could overcome logistical failure. The Red Ball Express represented logistics at its most basic and essential. Trucks, drivers, roads. Nothing sophisticated, nothing glamorous, but absolutely vital. Eisenhower's public recognition of the driver's contribution was unusual for the era and reflected his genuine appreciation for unglamorous but critical work. The contrast with German logistics was stark and telling. The Wehrmacht, despite its reputation as a modern mechanized force, relied heavily on horse-drawn transport. Germany employed more than 2.8 million horses during World War II to move supplies and equipment. German truck production was limited by steel shortages, fuel constraints, and manufacturing capacity devoted to weapons. When German mechanized units advanced, they frequently outran their logistics, a problem that contributed to defeats in Russia and North Africa. German forces in France in 1944 faced a logistical nightmare. Allied air superiority made daylight movement nearly impossible. French resistance sabotaged rail lines and ambushed supply convoys. The Wehrmacht's horse-drawn supply system, adequate for set-piece defensive operations, could not support mobile warfare. German units often fought with ammunition shortages, inadequate food supplies, and chronic fuel deficiencies. Captured German soldiers told interrogators that American logistic superiority was as demoralizing as American firepower superiority. By mid-November 1944, the strategic situation had changed sufficiently to allow the Red Bull Express to stand down. Antwerp's port facilities were finally cleared of German demolitions and opened to Allied shipping. The shorter supply line from Antwerp to the front reduced trucking distances dramatically. French railroads, repaired by American and British engineers, began operating on limited schedules. Portable gasoline pipelines laid across France started delivering fuel directly to forward depots. On November 16, 1944, the Red Ball Express officially ended operations after 82 days. The drivers, many of them more exhausted than they had ever been in their lives, returned to their original units. Some continued in other supply operations. Others transferred to combat roles as the Army, desperate for infantry replacements, began accepting African-American volunteers for frontline service. The final statistics told a story of achievement that military planners still study. 412,193 tons delivered. 6,000 trucks at peak operation, 23,000 drivers and support personnel, 75% African American. Average 900 vehicles on the road simultaneously. Distances covered up to 400 m one-way, operating continuously for 82 days without pause. But the real story was the truck. The GMC CCKW, dismissed by British experts as inadequate, proved itself the most valuable tactical vehicle of World War II. Its simplicity, the very characteristic that made it seem inferior, was its greatest strength. Drivers could repair CCKWs with basic tools. Mechanics could keep them running with improvised parts. The trucks could be abused, overloaded, and neglected. Yet, they continued functioning. The CCKW's reliability under abuse became legendary. Stories circulated of trucks running with cracked engine blocks held together by wire and determination. Of transmissions that should have failed continuing to shift gears through sheer mechanical stubbornness. Of trucks that rolled into depots with flat tires, overheated engines and failing brakes, delivered their cargo, received hasty repairs, and rolled out again hours later. The truck's simple, robust design meant that even severely damaged vehicles could often limp to their destination. General Patton stated flatly that the 2-in-1 or 2-ton truck is our most valuable weapon. He understood what many civilians did not. Without supply, armies become mobs. Tanks without fuel or sculpture. Rifles without ammunition are clubs. The most advanced weapons are useless if they cannot be sustained. The humble CCKW truck made modern mechanized warfare possible by solving the unglamorous problem of moving supplies. Colonel John Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander's son and himself a veteran logistics officer, wrote after the war that without the Red Bull truck drivers, the advance across France could not have been made. The trucks, specifically the GMC CCKW, enabled American forces to maintain momentum when any pause would have allowed German defenses to solidify. The war might have extended into 1946 without this logistic success. In December 1944, the concept faced its final test. German forces launched Operation Watch on the Rhine. The Ardennes Offensive, commonly known as the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's last major offensive in the West caught American forces by surprise, creating a dangerous bulge in Allied lines. The situation required massive rapid reinforcement and resupply. The Red Ball Express was officially over, but the trucks were not, and neither were the drivers. Reformed under different names, including the Little Red Ball, the White Ball Express, and other designations, convoy operations resumed. The same GMC CCKWs that had supplied Patton's advance now rushed reinforcements to contain the German breakthrough. The same African-American drivers who had proven themselves in summer returned to the roads in winter conditions that made August's problems seem trivial. Snow and ice covered French and Belgian roads. Blackout driving became even more dangerous. German air attacks increased as the Luftwaffe threw its reserves into supporting the offensive. Yet the trucks rolled. Ammunition reached besieged American units. Fuel kept tanks and trucks mobile. Reinforcements arrived to seal the Bulge's shoulders. The Battle of the Bulge was won by combat troops in desperate fights, but it was sustained by truck drivers who kept supply lines open in the worst winter weather Europe had seen in decades. Winter operations revealed new challenges. Engines froze overnight and had to be thawed before starting. Ice on roads made speed limits meaningless as trucks slid regardless of driver skill. Snow drifts blocked routes, requiring hours of digging to clear passage. Frostbite became a constant danger for drivers in open cab trucks with minimal heat. Yet, the supply convoys continued, proving that the logistic system developed during the Red Ball Express could adapt to any conditions. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, the CCKW continued serving. Trucks that had crossed France in 1944 now occupy Germany. They hauled displaced persons to refugee camps. They distributed food to starving civilian populations. They transported occupation troops across the defeated Reich. Some were shipped to the Pacific Theater where they served in the Philippines and Okinawa campaigns. Production continued until 1945. By war's end, General Motors had built more CCKW trucks than Germany built vehicles of all types combined. The total production, approximately 562,750 units, exceeded the entire pre-war truck inventory of most nations. These trucks served not just America, but supplied to Allied forces worldwide through Lend-Lease. British, French, Soviet, and Canadian armies all operated GMC CCKWs. The truck's simplicity translated to remarkable longevity. CCKWs remained in active American military service through the 1960s. The design was succeeded by the M35 series trucks in the 1950s, but older CCKWs continued in National Guard and Reserve units for years after. Many were sold as surplus to foreign militaries where they served into the 1970s and 80s. Some remain operational today in the hands of collectors and museums. The Red Bull Express drivers, particularly the African American majority, received recognition slowly and incompletely. The operation was publicized during the war, featured in newsreels and magazine articles. But the racial dimension was often downplayed or ignored in media intended for segregated American audiences. The 1952 film Red Bull Express, while acknowledging African American participation, was modified at Department of Defense insistence to show racial integration that did not exist in 1944. Many Red Bull veterans returned to an America still deeply segregated. Men who had risked their lives supplying the fight against fascism faced discrimination in housing, employment, and civil rights. Some used GI Bill benefits to obtain education and home loans, though even these benefits were often harder to access for African American. Banks refused loans. Universities imposed quotas. Employers passed over qualified black veterans for white applicants. Others found their military service dismissed or forgotten. But the story endured. In the 1980s and 90s, historians began fuller accounting of Red Bull Express operations. Veteran testimonies were recorded and preserved. Museums created exhibits documenting the convoy system and the soldiers who made it work. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans features extensive Red Bull Express materials, including restored GMC CCKW trucks and personal accounts from drivers. James Ruckert, who served with the 514th Quartermaster Regiment, told reporters years later, "I'm proud I served. We were young. We were scared, but we did what needed to be done." A lot of white folks didn't think black soldiers could handle responsibility. We proved them wrong. Every supply run that reached the front line on time, that was us proving we deserved respect. That was us fighting for freedom, foreign and domestic. Ruckert's words captured the double consciousness of African American World War II veterans. They fought for American victory while knowing America denied them full citizenship. They risked their lives for a nation that segregated them, discriminated against them, and often refused to recognize their contributions. Yet, they served with distinction, understanding that their performance under fire advanced the broader struggle for civil rights. The Red Bull Express became one more chapter in the long story of African Americans proving their worth to a skeptical nation. The technical lessons from Red Bull Express operations influenced American military logistics for decades. The concept of continuous supply convoys, dedicated routes with priority traffic control, and massive trucking operations became standard doctrine. During the Korean War, similar convoying systems supplied United Nations forces in Vietnam. Despite different terrain and tactical situations, truck convoys remained crucial to American operations. Modern military logistics still studies Red Bull Express planning and execution. The GMC CCKW design influenced post-war truck development globally. Its 6x6 configuration became standard for military medium tactical trucks. The concept of using mass-reduced, easily maintained vehicles, rather than specialized military designs became accepted practice. Countries around the world copied or adapted CCKW features in their own military truck programs. Soviet designers who received thousands of CCKWs through Lend-Lease studied the trucks carefully. Post-war Soviet military trucks, including the ZIL series, showed clear CCKW influence in layout and capability. The Soviets understood that the CCKW's greatest feature was not any single technical specification, but the entire package of adequate performance, simple maintenance, and massive availability. Modern military vehicles are far more sophisticated than the CCKW. They have computers, automatic transmissions, central tire inflation systems, and armor protection. But they still face the same fundamental challenge. How to move supplies reliably under combat conditions, while remaining simple enough for field maintenance. Every military truck designer since 1945 has worked in the shadow of the CCKW, trying to match its combination of capability and simplicity. The CCKW proved that excellence in military equipment is not always about having the best specifications. The British were correct that the ACKWX was underpowered and had handling limitations. But they were wrong about what mattered. In total war, adequate vehicles produced in overwhelming numbers defeat superior vehicles produced in limited quantities. Trucks that mechanics can repair with basic tools outperform trucks that need specialized equipment and factory support. Simplicity is its own form of sophistication. The British Army, which rejected the ACKWX in 1940, eventually operated thousands of CCKWs supplied through Lend-Lease. British drivers came to appreciate the same characteristics their evaluators had criticized. The long wheelbase that seemed awkward on narrow European roads provided excellent stability for heavy loads. The engine that seemed underpowered proved adequately strong and remarkably reliable. The simple design meant British mechanics trained on complex vehicles requiring precision maintenance could keep CCKWs running with whatever tools and parts were available. A British transport officer wrote in his after-action report that the American trucks, initially dismissed as crude, proved superior in sustained operations to British vehicles that required more sophisticated maintenance. The CCKW's ability to continue functioning despite neglect and abuse made it ideal for the chaos of combat logistics. British units learned to prefer CCKWs over their own trucks for long hauls under difficult conditions. The story of the GMC CCKW and the Red Ball Express is ultimately a story about what wins wars. Not the most advanced technology, not the most impressive specifications, not the vehicles that look best in promotional photographs or official demonstrations. What wins wars is reliable equipment produced in quantities that overwhelm the enemy, operated by determined people who understand their mission matters. The CCKW was not the best truck of World War II. It was adequate, but adequate trucks by the hundreds of thousands driven by drivers willing to work until they collapsed supplied the most successful military campaign in history. The humble 2 and 1 or 2 ton truck, dismissed as worthless by British experts in 1940, became the lifeline that sustained Allied armies from Normandy to the Elbe River. And the drivers, 75% of them African American soldiers fighting for a country that still denied them basic civil rights, proved that excellence knows no racial boundary. They kept the trucks rolling when any pause meant American soldiers might run out of ammunition or fuel. They drove through exhaustion, through fear, through discrimination because the mission mattered more than personal comfort or recognition. These men returned home to a nation that had not yet fully recognized their humanity. Many faced the same discrimination they had known before the war. But they had proven something important. They had demonstrated that African American soldiers could handle complex critical missions under the most demanding conditions. They had shown that segregation was a lie, that ability and determination had nothing to do with skin color. The Red Bull Express became part of the evidence that would eventually help dismantle Jim Crow segregation in the decades after the war. On August 25, 1944, Sergeant William Henderson finished tightening the last bolt on a CCKW engine and watched the truck roll out to join the convoy. The British said these trucks were worthless. Henderson knew better. He knew that in the next 82 days, these supposedly inadequate vehicles would write themselves into history. Not through dramatic combat action or technological superiority, but through simple, stubborn, unglamorous work. Hauling supplies, keeping armies moving, winning the war. The GMC, CCKW, the Jimmy, the Juice, and a half the truck. The British rejected the vehicle that became America's secret weapon. The lifeline of the Red Ball Express.